All right, looks like we are live on YouTube, so we can go ahead and get started.
Welcome to Be Kind to Your Mind, a mental health awareness seminar. I'm Ashling Lister, and this event is hosted by the Campbell Youth Commission in the City of Campbell. Feel free to type in your questions on the YouTube Live, just make sure that they are appropriate. Our first speaker is Eric Bowerly. He is a marriage and family therapist and school counselor at Discovery Charter School. Eric is also a boxing coach, which he often incorporates into this clinical practice in boxing-themed anger and anxiety management groups. He has worked in the mental health field for 16 years and has experience working with children, adolescents, families, and couples. He also received specialized training in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and worked on a team to address the needs of children who experienced trauma. He will be talking about the ways to see if someone is suffering, including warning signs, and offer resources. Eric, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just getting my presentation slides up on the screen for everybody here. All right. Well, first of all, thanks to everybody. Thank you for anyone who's out there watching this right now, and thank you for having me. It's I take so much pride in the fact that I even got invited to participate in this. I hadn't heard of the Campbell Youth Commission before I received this invitation, and it just seems like an extremely cool program. In fact, anybody that's participating in the Campbell Youth Program or is here today to watch this is officially way more mature than I was when I was your age, so I'm very impressed. And when the Campbell Youth Commission reached out to me through Zara, the question that was posed to me was, how can we tell if our friend might be experiencing some sort of mental health crisis? And if so, what can we do to help? So that's really about, well, how do I be a vigilant friend? How do I be someone who's a safe friend who's going to be able to be helpful to my friends, right? So that's what I'll present on today. I put my email address down there as well, just in case you didn't get a chance to ask any questions and you wanted to ask me specifically, you can feel free to email me anytime. And before I start presenting, I will say this, if you're here on a Sunday to learn about mental health, my guess is you're already a very good vigilant friend who's already doing a really good job of it. Nonetheless, I'm happy to try and give you some insights as well. Here's kind of going to be the organization to my presentation today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you some of the types of warning signs that I, as a therapist and counselor, look out for to determine whether or not someone might be experiencing some sort of mental health crisis. And then I will also give you a couple strategies that you can use if you feel like your friend might be experiencing something like that as well. And then I'll give you some resources at the end. Now, before I show you my first slide, which shows you some of those warning signs, what I will say is that by themselves, they're not necessarily warning signs, right? A lot of people look to the mental health field because they want some black and white answers. In other words, they want to know, if my friend does this, does it mean that? Or if my friend does that, it means this. And really, in the mental health field, it's usually a lot more like, if this happens, it could mean this, or it could mean that, or it could be good, or it could be bad, right? So it's important to be comfortable with that gray area, because what you don't want to do is pathologize your friends, right? Or pathologize yourself because you might have one of these quote unquote warning signs. It doesn't mean necessarily that something's wrong. It's more like a way to say to yourself, maybe I should check in with that person, right? All right, so I'll go ahead and share with you some of these common warning signs that I nonetheless look out for. So here's my list of common mental health warning signs that I look out for. So I might be looking for a sudden change in their mood and personality, social isolation, a sense of hopelessness, talking or writing about harming or killing oneself, or just a lot of like death and dying in their discussion or in their art, and a previous suicide attempt. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about each of these individually with you in just a moment. And what I'll do so that we don't just pathologize these things immediately is I'll share with you what it looks like when I'm concerned about it, but also tell you what it could be that might not be that concerning at all, right? And maybe a little bit how to distinguish between the two. Okay, so here's the first one. A sudden change in mood or personality. Now, I chose the title to this particular screen very specifically because I put mood or personality, because I think a lot of times when people are trying to look out for their friends and see if something's wrong, they end up looking for only two things. They try and see, does my friend seem sad or does my friend seem anxious? And those two are two very good things to look out for. However, as a counselor, I end up looking out for a lot more than just that. In fact, low mood and sadness is not even the most common symptom of depression in adolescence. The most common symptom of depression in adolescence is actually irritability. So you might be looking out for irritability. You might also be looking out for a flat affect. That means they're expressing almost no emotion at all. Sometimes they might seem almost robotic or monotone. They might seem suddenly more withdrawn. And I'm not even looking at just like the sort of negative emotions on the spectrum. Sometimes if I'm noticing that someone all of a sudden seems to have excessive energy and jubilation or extreme happiness, especially if that becomes connected with things like riskier behaviors, right? So sometimes you'll see that with riskier behaviors, like suddenly they're using drugs and alcohol, or they're more promiscuous, but in a way that's not safe, right? So reason that might be a concern as well is sometimes that's connected with what is termed a manic behavior, which is part of a bipolar diagnosis. Now, I'm not expecting you to diagnose your friends. Don't even try to diagnose your friends. It's not going to help you. Don't try and diagnose yourself, right? It takes therapists doing a lot of assessing to come up with an actual diagnosis. What I'm really telling you to look out for is, does something just feel different? Does my friend feel different in some way to me? And the reason I say that is a lot of times right after someone's had a serious mental health crisis, if you end up talking to the people in their lives, very common for them to say, before it happened, something just felt different about the person, right? Now here's the or it could be this, right? Adolescents, teenagers, youth are going to be trying on lots of different hats. That's a part of development. So for example, they might be at one point in their life saying, I wonder what it would like to be a part of the cosplay subculture. I wonder what it'd be like to be part of the gaming subculture, or whatever sorts of subcultures exist within your school. And as they do that, they might end up experiencing sort of different mood and different behaviors, right? And doesn't necessarily mean that something's wrong with them. So just pay attention to your gut. If your gut ends up telling you something just feels off with my friend, then you might want to be checking in with them, and I'll give you some examples later on of what that check-in might look like. All right, here's the next one. Social isolation. I'm going to jump right into what a red flag social isolation looks like to me. Red flag social isolation is if they are suddenly pushing away their friends, or they didn't have friends to begin with, but also they don't seem to have any positive connections with any school staff members or anything like that. And on top of that, they don't have a particularly positive relationship with their family either. If all of those things are going on, then I, as a counselor, am really concerned, because if a mental health crisis does happen, this is somebody that's going to spiral very quickly down because they don't have a lot of supports, right? Or it could be, here's my or it could be this, right? It could be, I cannot tell you how often I get parents and teachers that come to me with a concern about a child that they think is socially isolated, and then I check in with that child, and actually they're a very happy kid who has friends. It's just that that person just happens to be more introverted, and on their recess, they like to get space away from the classroom dynamic to just be by themselves for a while, right? So sometimes people unintentionally pathologize introversion. And here's a good way to distinguish between whether or not it's a sort of genuine social isolation or just somebody that likes to spend time alone, is you're kind of paying attention to their baseline. So if you happen to have a friend who was a very social person, but all of a sudden they're cutting off all their contacts, then from their baseline, that's pretty concerning. Or if it was a person that was more introverted before, they probably had one or two close friends. It's very rare to have someone whose introversion is so strong they have no friends at all. In fact, if they do, then that's something I'm actually a little bit concerned about. But most people, even when they're introverted, have one or two close friendships that are really important to them. And if suddenly they're pushing those friends away, right, then that's different from their baseline. And then that's a social isolation I might be concerned about and I might want to check in with them on. All right. A sense of hopelessness. So the type of therapy I am experienced in is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And one way that we look at depression is through what's called the cognitive triad. And the cognitive triad is this: it's a lens that somebody who's experiencing depression often views their world through, right? And they view it in three contexts. So about the world, they think the world is bad, right? And when they think about themselves, they think I'm defective or I'm worthless. And then when they think about the future, they think it's hopeless and nothing's going to change and nothing can change it, right? That's sort of the lens that somebody who's really depressed starts to view their entire existence. And that third one is particularly concerning for me. When somebody suddenly starts saying things are never going to get better, that's somebody who isn't usually going to be willing to try a lot to improve their situation because they don't see the point of trying it. So once again, that's somebody that can spiral very quickly down, right? So I definitely want to check in with that person. Here's the or it could be. Or it could be somebody that's just a little bit pessimistic. Pessimism often gets a sort of bad rap in our culture, but pessimism isn't actually always bad. Some people do have a higher predisposition to be pessimistic. But pessimistic people often are really good critical thinkers, really logical, good at planning and preparing for worst case scenarios. So it's not always a bad thing. Obviously, if you are really pessimistic, you do want to try and improve your optimism as well. But the distinction that I would have here is if it's a really profound pessimism, like they can never see the silver lining in anything, and connected to that, they have that hopelessness that it's never going to change. Now that's a warning flag for me that I'm going to probably need to check in with them about. All right. Talking or writing about harming or killing oneself, or as I said earlier, just a lot of death and dying in their conversation or in their art. Now, obviously, this one, you would understand why it might be a concern, right? And the truth is, a lot of research has shown that when people have attempted suicide or have committed suicide, and researchers have gone and talked to the people in their lives, nearly almost in every case, they had told somebody about it beforehand or had written it or expressed it through art somewhere before they actually did it. And you would think, if that's the case, then why aren't we able to stop nearly all suicides? Because they're telling us about it before it happens. And that's because when you also talk to the people in their lives, they will say, I didn't think it was serious. I didn't think it was real. And is that because all these people are just like really naive people? The answer is no. It's because very often it didn't sound very serious because it might have been posed as almost like a joke, or it might have just seemed like a really compelling poem that they wrote, right? So I just have learned as a professional, you're taught, and I encourage you to do the same, to just always treat it like it's serious. Here's an example for you. I was working with a youth once who had been lectured by more than one teacher that he should stop making jokes about killing himself, because he would always say, oh my gosh, I just want to blow my brains out or something like that. And people just assumed it was crass humor. And then I ended up working with him and I said, I also thought it was just crass humor. And I said, hey, even though I don't think you should joke like that, I do want to check with you. Have you had any thoughts like that before? And the answer I got was, yes, I'm saying it because that's what I actually intend to do. And that child really did need clinical support, and we ended up getting him a lot of help, right? So I always take it serious. Now, I did throw or it could be down here. And I almost didn't put one on this slide because it really doesn't matter what else it could be. If you hear something like this, you just need to treat it like it's serious. Nonetheless, here's an or it could be. Suicide is a really taboo topic, and a lot of people end up becoming curious about it, sort of morbidly curious about it, because it is a kind of interesting topic as well. And so then they do end up doing research about it. And as they do, of course, they end up talking more about it. And of course, they end up expressing it more in their writing or in their art, because when you're dealing with something that's really tragic, you need to process your emotions about it in some way. Nonetheless, once again, let me just say, if you're seeing or hearing that, then something needs to happen. And we'll talk more about what that something needs to be, even if it's just a check-in with the person. All right, the final warning sign that I said is if they've had a previous suicide attempt. So psychological researchers are always trying to figure out how can we predict that someone might be suicidal so that we can prevent it. And they've come up with some things here and there, but nothing has been a really great predictor except for this one. This one, almost all suicide attempts that were successful were preceded by one that wasn't successful. It's one of the unfortunate best ways that we're able to predict whether or not someone's going to end up committing suicide. So if someone has attempted suicide in the past, it increases the probability they're going to try it again in the future. And one of the unfortunate things about this is a lot of people in our society will dismiss that first attempt as not that serious, or they were just attention seeking, right? There's been incidences where I've called parents before and I've been like, hey, I just need to let you know, I just learned from your child that your child expressed they had attempted to kill themselves, right? And the parent will say to me, oh yeah, we knew about that. It wasn't serious. They were just attention seeking, right? So it can be often dismissed. Here's the thing, it should never be dismissed like this. And the reason is, even if that's true, even if they weren't seriously trying to kill themselves, or they really were just trying to seek attention, first of all, the fact that they think that that's how they need to get attention, that's concerning. That's something that we need to talk about so they can find a more effective way. But secondly, as we already discussed, it increases the probability that they're going to try it again in the future. And this, I can almost guarantee you, the next attempt is going to be a more severe attempt. And if that trajectory continues, it becomes a more severe attempt after that until they do eventually end up actually hurting or killing themselves. So anytime I hear that somebody has attempted suicide in the past, or if you've heard about it from a friend, it's something to take very seriously. Now, before I move on, I am going to talk about a special note here. Cutting does not necessarily mean that somebody's suicidal. So you might have seen or heard or know somebody who engages in this behavior, right? Where they might cut their skin using like a paper clip or even a razor blade. Now, obviously it is concerning when somebody's engaging in a cutting behavior, but people often mistakenly assume it means that person's necessarily suicidal. And actually, oftentimes, if you talk to somebody that's engaging in cutting, what they'll tell you is they do it because it helps them to feel a little bit emotionally better. And somebody that's doing something to help themselves feel a little bit emotionally better is somebody that has hope. They're saying, I'm still willing to try things to make myself feel better. Of course, it's not a healthy way to try and feel better, and it's certainly not a sustainable way to try and feel better. And what I mean by that is, unfortunately, cutting is a little bit like a drug in that it takes either more often or more severe every single time to have the same effect. So over time, somebody that's using that particular means to try and raise their mood will find that they're starting to cut deeper, right? Or cut more often until eventually they're getting an infection, or they accidentally cut too deep and really hurt themselves, or no doubt people have unintentionally killed themselves in the process, right? So cutting is definitely a concern that if I had a friend that was doing that, I'm going to check in with them. I'm going to encourage them to get help or support, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're suicidal. All right, so what are some things that you can do? How you can help a friend. So one of the first things I encourage you to do is learn to make yourself a safe person. And what I mean by that is remove jokes from your humor that might unintentionally isolate someone. I have always in my life been like a big joker. I was always the class clown when I was a kid. And when I was younger, I used to use a lot of like jokes that I didn't realize would isolate people that were close to me. I didn't think it would ever have that effect. But let me give you an example. If you know somebody, or you yourself are using jokes where you're like accusing someone of being mentally ill, or, oh, that person should just kill themselves, right? You might just mean it jokingly. You might not mean to offend anybody. But if you happen to have a friend in your group who is going through a mental health crisis or has been thinking about killing themselves, chances are they're not going to come to talk to you about it because it's not going to feel safe to talk with you about it, right? Another example, I can't believe I still hear this in 2020, but sometimes I'm still hearing people say jokes like, oh, that's so gay, or you're so gay, right? If you have a friend who's sort of struggling with their identity in terms of their sexual orientation, and you're using that type of humor, chances are if they need to talk about it with somebody, you're not the person they're going to come and talk about it with, because you're not going to feel safe to them. So one of the first steps you can do to be a vigilant and helpful, safe friend is starting to remove that sort of stuff from your humor, right? I'm not asking you to police all your friends' humors, only pay attention. Am I using the type of humor that might unintentionally isolate people? Next, if your gut tells you something feels off, then ask if everything's okay. That seems super obvious, but you would be surprised how often people miss the second part of that, right? So they'll notice something feels off, they'll talk about it with their other friends, they'll talk about it with their parents, but nobody ever ends up going to that person and being like, hey, I just wanted to see if you're okay. And I think the reason that happens is that a lot of times we don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. So if we ask if they're okay, are we going to make them feel awkward or uncomfortable? So let me remove some anxiety about that. It's almost never experienced in that way. It's almost always experienced exactly how it's intended. I care about you and I'm checking on you because I care about you. And it feels good to feel cared about. So when someone checks on you to see if you're okay, it feels good. It might feel a little bit awkward at first, but it feels mostly good to know that somebody cares about you. So if you get that gut feeling, learn to trust your gut. If something feels a little bit off, check, are you okay? And when you do that, be prepared to do some active listening. Now, when I was younger, I remember they brought a presenter to one of my classes, and he gave this big presentation similar to what I'm telling you today. And during that presentation, it was like, really learn to be there and listen to your friends. And I thought it was the stupidest thing I ever heard because it sounded very Hallmark, and it didn't sound like something that would actually help. And then I started working on a crisis line when I was a young adult, and I realized it's tremendously powerful. And here's how I learned that. When I was working on this crisis line, we had to have a 3-day training, 8 hours for 3 days straight, right? And I thought that training was going to be, here's how to give good advice. If someone says this, say this. If someone says this, say that. But instead, they said, don't give any advice. That is not your job. Instead, the whole training was how to listen. Right. And so for 3 days straight, for 8 hours, we just practiced listening, because learning to listen is actually something you have to do. A lot of people hear, but they don't listen. So here's the shortest explanation that I can give you for active listening. This is what it looks like. Somebody comes to you and they share that they're concerned or hurt or upset about something. And then what you say is what you just heard them say, but in your own words. And you do it to make sure to clarify that you understood what they said. And that's all you do. And that's tremendously powerful. And here's why it's powerful. It's because a lot of times when people give advice, they don't realize they're doing this, but they're passing a judgment, right? They're saying you should have done this, or I would have done that, or I saw someone else handle it better by doing this. And people often feel very closed to hearing what they experience as judgment. This strips all judgment from it. This just says, I'm just trying to make sure I understand your experience. And when you do that, it suddenly makes it safe to talk to you. So then they start sharing more. And as they share more, what's happening is they're thinking out loud about whatever their experience is, which maybe beforehand they were trying to bury. But now that they're not burying it, they're doing what we call processing it. They're processing the emotion. And every time they process the emotion, it decreases the intensity of that emotion a little bit. So anytime that you've successfully done active listening, you really just did a really important therapeutic thing. There are types of therapy that's almost exclusively what they do. There's a type of therapy called Rogerian therapy, where that's pretty much what the therapist does. Active listening, active listening, active listening. And the person ends up finding the solutions to the problems themselves, right? Now, practice it. Well, I'll tell you this, when you first practice it, it feels really awkward to do it, right? So you really got to practice it before it feels natural to just repeat what you heard from somebody. But if you get good at it, this is what will end up happening. All of a sudden, lots of people are going to start coming to you to tell you about their problems. And that leads to my next point. And that is, you got to know the limitations of what you can and cannot do to help. So one thing I want you to pay attention to as you're trying to be a vigilant and helpful friend is the impact that it's having on your own mental health. A lot of times when people start coming to you with problems, or one person starts coming with their problems again and again and again and again, you want to be a good friend, but you start to notice it feels really draining on you, right? Suddenly you might notice, I'm starting to dread or like about seeing my friend, right? Or it's starting to affect my life. And a lot of times when that happens, people start to think to themselves like, am I not a good friend? Maybe that friend's even guilting you. You could do more for me. But no, pay attention to that drainage. If you're starting to feel drained in that way, that's actually your mind and your body saying this person's issue that they're dealing with is bigger than what I'm capable of helping them with. So that means I got to have this discussion with them. And the discussion is, look, I can tell you're going through a lot. I know you're going through a lot because as you're sharing it with me, I'm starting to notice it even makes me stressed. And that makes me realize that I can't necessarily be the one to hold this for you or to help you with it. But I am more than happy to try and help you find the person who can help you with it. I'll walk you over to the school counselor, or I'll bring you to a teacher that you trust, or I'll give you some crisis line numbers that you can call, because I can't necessarily be the person to hold it. And that in itself is actually helpful to your friend, because if you notice your own personal functioning is declining, your grades start going down, or you start losing connections with your other friends, or your relationship with your family gets bad as this relationship gets closer, what you're having is called codependency. And codependency does not help this person, and it doesn't help you. Setting a clear boundary for them is actually helpful to them, even if it makes them a little bit distressed. That's helpful, and it role models something really healthy for you as well. You also need to know what secrets you can and can't keep. I'm a mandated reporter, so legally, there are secrets that I'm not allowed to keep, but I encourage you to keep the same precedent. The secrets I'm not allowed to keep are this. If I think that someone can get hurt, or I think someone that they know can get hurt, then I can't keep that secret. I have to tell somebody, and I encourage the same of you. So if somebody comes to you and says, look, I'm thinking I might kill myself, but please don't tell anyone. You're my good friend. Let's keep this a secret. You got to tell someone, right? Or if they say I'm being abused by somebody at home, you got to tell somebody. And a lot of times people are scared to tell because they don't want to hurt their friendship. I totally get that. But I can tell you from years of experience, it almost never hurts the friendship. What it ends up doing, like usually there's a moment of upsetness between the friendship, but ultimately this friend realizes it came from a caring place. And a lot of times it makes the friendship stronger. In the few cases where I've seen that it hurt the friendship permanently, like they were no longer friends, and I've talked to the person, do you regret doing it? They almost never say they regretted doing it. They say, no, it had to be done, and I feel good about what I did, right? And finally, encourage them to talk to a professional. If your school has a school counselor, that's a great thing. Some schools don't. Utilize that school counselor, right? Encourage them to talk to their parents about possibly getting some therapy, which is one of the reasons you want to be a safe person, not like knocking the mental health crisis that people experience, right? All right, finally, here's some resources that you can utilize as well. These are some hotlines, different types of crisis hotlines. Sometimes people don't realize that these are actually a really useful thing. It's super useful to use a crisis hotline because what you're going to be talking to is a professionally trained person that you don't know that has been trained not to judge you, right? And so when you're able to talk free of any judgment, you end up, like I said, processing your own emotions. You'll end up coming with really powerful solutions for yourself. And these ones kind of have different themes. So some of them are suicide and crisis, could be any crisis. You define what the crisis is. There's the rape crisis hotline. I think that's run by the YWCA, an LGBTQ plus hotline. And I even tried out this one at the bottom here before I put it on here just to make sure it's real. It's called the crisis text line. And it is in fact real. You can, if you don't feel like talking, you can text with a counselor. All right, so that's my presentation for you, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions if anybody feels like they have any questions to ask.
Okay, our first question is, how can we talk to our friends about our mental health?
Yeah, so if you're talking about your own mental health, one thing is you're trying to determine, like, is this friendship a safe friendship, a trusted friendship? So if you trust the person, here's how I define trust. A lot of people don't actually have a definition of trust. Trust is the belief that this person wouldn't do something to intentionally hurt me, right? And if you have that kind of bond with somebody, it's pretty safe to share things with them. So you can share, like, hey, I really have a lot of trust in you, and I'd like to talk about something that I've been experiencing, or I want to open up the lines of communication between us. If you ever needed something from me, and please feel free to come to me, and I want you to be someone that I can come to as well. And that sort of opens up that conversation because it's saying we're kind of taking our friendship to a new level, which is let's be safe people for each other. That's the conversation that you're having by saying that, right? So really, while it's sometimes like scary to have that conversation, it's actually a very flattering thing. Anybody that ever comes to me and says like, look, I've noticed, Eric, that you're like a really safe person in my life, and I'd like us to have a relationship where if you ever needed something for me in terms of mental health and I ever needed something from you, we could come to each other. I would be honored if somebody came to me for that. So I wouldn't be too intimidated to have that discussion, I suppose. Thank you for that question, though. Hopefully I answered it.
Okay, and then our next question is like, where do you draw the line between pessimism and a dangerous thought pattern? Like, how do you know where that is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be like hard to tell. So pessimism is just sort of like the glass half empty position, right? But so a difference between it being like an unhealthy pessimism would be like literally they never see the positive. Like, so I do this intervention with people. I'll do an intervention called Fortunately, Unfortunately, right? Or I'll do Unfortunately, Fortunately. So if I'm working with somebody who I notice is really pessimistic, I'll be like, okay, tell me the thing that's kind of upsetting you, and we'll phrase it as unfortunately, right? They'll be like, unfortunately, I didn't do good on my test. And then I'll say, okay, after that, we're going to say fortunately, right? And then we're going to reframe it in a new way. So they might say, unfortunately, I failed my test. Fortunately, I learned that what I need to do is study more the night before, right? Sometimes I'll work with somebody that cannot frame a fortunately. They cannot find a way to frame it as fortunate, right? So that's somebody who can never, like their pessimism is so strong that they cannot see through a lens of any benefit, right? But even then, there's like something to work with. But when I find that also on top of that, which is what we kind of discussed earlier, that it comes with a pure sense of hopelessness, which is like, not only is nothing good, there's no way it can change. That to me is a very unhealthy thought pattern, because that's a person that sees no way that their life will improve. And oftentimes they will spiral, and it is unfortunately quite common that spiraling starts to become what's called suicidal ideation. They start thinking about hurting or killing themselves, right? So that's sort of where it starts to become a dangerous thought pattern.
Okay, and then another question we had was, what do people do or say on hotlines?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a super interesting question. So I worked on a hotline, and as you can imagine, it's a lot of prank calls. I get a lot of prank calls. I don't know why people waste their time doing the prank calls, but yeah, you get a lot of those, and I didn't really care. It kept it entertaining sometimes. But really, the crisis hotlines, sometimes it was people who were dealing with suicidal ideation, but it wasn't just that. It's just the rule we had at the hotline is what we would say, what's a crisis? And the answer to that question was whatever the person defines it as. So I would get calls from, I'm really stressed out because I just went through a bad breakup, right? To calls of I'm actively having a psychotic break right now, to calls of somebody close to me just passed away. And it really was whatever they defined it as. That's what we ended up dealing with.
Okay, thank you. And then our last question is going to be, if you do notice unusual patterns, what should you do?
Mm-hmm. So if I'm noticing that a friend is, like we saw some of those warning signs and we're concerned, so I'm going to go up to that friend and I'm going to say to them, hey, I just wanted to check in with you. I want to see if everything's okay, right? And I would probably let it hang there for a second and see what they give me. And they might be defensive at first, might be like, nothing's wrong with me, right? And I don't feel necessarily as a friend a need to push it. What I feel a need to do is just demonstrate that I'm someone that's there for them and be like, oh, okay, maybe I misread it. That said, if ever there is anything bothering you, just want you to know that you can come to me. Because a lot of times if there is something, they will come to you later, right? Now, I might also say why. I might say, hey, I wanted to check in with you. I want to see if everything's okay. And if they're like, everything's fine, you'll be like, oh, okay. The reason I was wondering was you had looked sadder lately, right? Or the reason I was wondering is I noticed like you are really having trouble seeing the positive side of anything lately. So that's what made me think that maybe something was okay. But if you say you're okay, I trust you. That said, if you ever need to, please know that you can come to me, right? Now, if it's one of those other things that I told you about, like they're talking, I'm thinking of hurting myself or I'm thinking of killing myself. That's a hard conversation to have, but the conversation that, I would let them know I'm going to tell somebody, right? So I would say, hey, I'm really concerned about you, and I know you don't want me to tell anyone, but I really think we should. I usually would try and do it like, let's do it together, right? Why don't we go talk to the counselor about it? I'll go with you, right? Why don't we go talk to a teacher about it? And if they're like, no, I don't want to tell anyone, I'm going to do it anyways, right? Because I'm not going to let it be on my conscience if I didn't say something and they did end up hurting themselves. Even though it wouldn't be your fault, you still don't want it on your conscience, right? So hopefully that kind of answers that.
Okay, and that concludes this. Thank you, Eric, for speaking. Thank you for everyone who attended. And as always, the City of Campbell for helping us make this possible.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Eric. We really enjoyed having you speak today and look forward to future opportunities.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful job. And I look forward to, hearing more during the debrief from Julie.